The Iron Maiden, an anthropomorphic sarcophagus with spikes on the inside, the ultimate symbol of medieval cruelty. But this symbol is a lie. The Iron Maiden was never used in the Middle Ages. It was created in the late 18th century as a gruesome spectacle. Historian Johann Philipp Siebenkees first described it in Nuremberg in 1793. Museum archives confirm it. This was an exhibit to attract the public, not an ancient instrument. This revelation is more than just correcting a mistake. It shows that our perception of torture has been shaped by propaganda. If the ultimate symbol is a fake, what else do we get wrong? Why was the reality, based on psychology and jurisprudence, replaced by sensational but false images? The greatest hoax in the history of torture will be exposed in Section 8. This brings us to two paradoxes. First, why did the Inquisition, which held almost absolute power, use torture in only 2 to 5% of cases? Its goal was a confession at any cost. Second, what explains the hundreds of pages in legal codes that meticulously restricted torture? Their ultimate goal was to inflict unbearable pain. These are not rhetorical questions. In the Carolina Code of 1532, only 8 of its 218 articles regulated interrogation under duress. The answers to these questions will completely change your view of history. We will find the first answer in Section 6, the second in Section 9, and they will reveal the true face of the justice system. You are used to seeing torture as the chaotic violence and sadism of the Dark Ages. By the end of this investigation, you will see a cold and rational engineering discipline. This was a system designed by engineers, commissioned by lawyers, and executed according to strict protocols. The key words here are engineering, biomechanics, and psychology. We are used to thinking of the executioner as a butcher. We will show you him as a surgeon who knows exactly where and how to cut to achieve his goal. To think of torture as chaotic violence is like trying to open a complex lock with a sledgehammer. We will show that it was, rather, a key, crafted with knowledge of every pin in the human body and psyche. You came here for stories about monsters. Instead, you will see a story of brilliant engineers, and that is the most terrifying part. To ensure you don't get lost in this labyrinth, here are 3 points on our road. In 6 minutes, we will analyze the biomechanics of the Spanish boot. You will understand why the characteristic crack of bones was its main engineering objective. In 15 minutes, you will learn how ordinary water, thanks to the laws of hydrodynamics, became more effective than complex mechanisms, and why the Inquisition valued it so highly. In 20 minutes, we will return to the Iron Maiden. We will not only debunk the myth, but also name those who created this great historical hoax and for what purpose. Prepare yourself. The first device in our arsenal will break you without a single blow. How could it be that a punishment that left not a single bruise on the body, the pillory, was considered one of the cruelest tortures in medieval codes? At first glance, it is just public shaming, unpleasant but tolerable. However, the reality was more terrifying. The punishment could last for days, without food, water, or protection from the weather. In some German lands, 3 days in the pillory were equivalent to lifelong exile. The main blow was to social status. In a society where reputation was everything, this meant civil death. The engineers of humiliation amplified the effect with masks of shame, a pig for a glutton, a long tongue for a gossip. A person was turned into a living caricature of their sin. But they went further, creating devices that transformed humiliation into physical torture without a single blow. Why did a simple wooden device known as the scold's bridle evoke panic and terror in women? Its design is harmless, 2 blocks with holes for the neck and wrists, locking the hands in a prayer-like position. It is merely a restriction of movement. But what made it hellish was the environment. Complete immobilization meant absolute defenselessness. The victim could not dodge thrown filth, cover her face from spit, or swat away insects. 16th century English archives describe a woman left for 6 hours in the sun. She could not wipe the drying filth from her cheeks. The psychological terror of the crowd became real physical suffering. The engineers understood. The crowd could be used as a weapon. All that was needed was the right frame for the victim. This brings us to a legal fact. Why, in the treatises of the time, Was punishment by shame ranked alongside the severing of a hand? Because honor was not an abstraction. The law treated it as a tangible asset like property. Its loss was equivalent to modern-day bankruptcy and complete social isolation. In that society, honor was like fertile soil. Public humiliation washed that soil away, and even if the plant itself was not broken, it could no longer grow. This was a cold legal procedure, not the spontaneous fury of a mob. Lawyers and engineers worked in tandem. They destroyed social status to prepare the accused for the next stage. We have seen how the spirit was broken. Now let's move on to the technologies that broke bones with surgical precision. So, we have established that the foundation of the engineering of hell was psychological weaponry. Its purpose was to break the will, isolate from society, and make a person vulnerable. But this was not enough. The court required a formal confession obtained under physical pressure. Thus, a technical requirement for new devices arose. Engineers had to shift from the social body to the physical body. The key demand: pain must not be chaotic, but metered, controlled, and reversible. The first brilliant response to this challenge was a device as simple as a vice and as effective as a surgical instrument: the Spanish boot. The next technology taught executioners not just to inflict pain, but to listen to it. How did the Spanish boot get its terrifying reputation if it was essentially just two boards and a screw? The executioner would tighten them around the shin, sometimes driving wedges between them. It seems like a simple leg vise, designed to crush. However, engineering reconstructions show that its genius was not in its force, but in its control. The slow, inexorable pressure broke down psychological defenses more effectively than any blow. It's the difference between hitting ice with a hammer and the slow freezing of water in a rock crevice. The first can be endured. The second inevitably shatters the stone from within. But the greatest horror lay in the sound. The methodical crack of the slowly breaking shin bones was audible to everyone present, and this sound was not a side effect. It was a key part of the legal procedure. The moment the accused screamed, the inquisitor remained impassive. Interrogation records show that he was not waiting for an answer. He was waiting for a sound. The characteristic crack of bone was an objective auditory signal. It meant that a certain degree of torture had been reached, which could be recorded in the protocol. After each hammer blow on the wedge, there was a pause of up to 5 minutes, and the question was asked again with icy calm. This was a dialogue not with the person, but with their body. The accused understood. He wasn't in the hands of a sadist, but inside a soulless machine that would methodically destroy him. This cold calculation broke the will faster than the pain. The system had won, but this was only meaningful under one condition: the material had to survive to sign the confession. That is why in many engravings, a doctor stands next to the executioner. His function was the very opposite of humanism. He monitored the pulse and breathing to ensure the accused did not die from shock or lose consciousness. Losing consciousness legally interrupted the interrogation and rendered it unsuccessful. The doctor was a technical specialist in the exploitation of the human body. In some legal codes, death under torture was considered a legal accident that nullified the case and could result in a fine for the judge. The Spanish boot was ideal for this system. Localized, unbearable pain rarely led to death. It was clean torture. But when it was necessary to affect the entire body at once, the engineers created its queen. So we have seen the engineering genius in its simplicity: controlled pressure, an auditory signal for the lawyers, and a doctor to monitor the resource. This was the science of localized impact. But the boot had its limits. It broke legs, but it did not always break the will of the most resilient. The system required a tool of total control. How to affect every joint and every ligament simultaneously. The engineers answered this challenge by shifting from the principle of compression to the principle of tension. Thus, the rack was born, the pinnacle of biomechanical engineering, pushing the human body to its absolute limits. We have just seen how the body was broken from the outside. Now we will see how it was torn apart from the inside. How did a primitive wooden frame with two rollers, the rack, become a universal instrument? It seems simple. The body is secured and stretched, but the reality went beyond simple stretching. The victim's body could be elongated by up to 15 centimeters, 6 inches. That's more than the height of a smartphone. The biomechanics of this process were horrific. First, the muscles would tighten, then the ligaments would tear with a snap, after which the joints would be pulled from their sockets, shoulders, elbows, hips, knees. But the most terrifying part was not the force, but the sound. Each turn of the winch was accompanied by the loud click of a ratchet mechanism. That click meant there was no going back. The tension was locked in. The torture became a series of irreversible steps toward complete destruction. And that sound turned the engineer into the master of the most terrifying human emotion. When designing the rack, what was the engineer thinking about? The victim's screams or the strength of the ratchet? He was solving a technical problem: how to apply maximum and uniform force to the body with minimal energy expenditure. For him, it was about materials and mechanics. But during testing, he made a discovery. The most powerful effect was produced not by the stretching itself, but by the pause before the next turn and that very click. He realized he had created a machine that generated not pain, but the unbearable anticipation of pain. It's like holding your breath. What's excruciating is not the lack of air itself, but the panic that builds with every second of waiting. The victim was broken not by the stretching, but by the inability to endure the mental strain. The rack turned time into an enemy. But this ingenious device had one critical flaw from the lawyer's perspective. Why was the rack, the queen of tortures, used less frequently than the Spanish boot? It might seem that even medieval judges had limits to their cruelty, but it wasn't about morality, it was about jurisprudence. The main problem with the rack was its irreversibility. It almost always led to severe injuries or death. And according to the laws of the time, a confession obtained from a dying or maimed person could be challenged. The rack spoiled the evidence. In their records, judges wrote paradoxical instructions to use the rack but without causing injury. The 16th century Spanish inquisitor Nicolau Aymeric, in his manual, explicitly warned against its use because it too often ruined the evidence. The rack was a nuclear option, powerful but messy. Therefore, engineers began to search for a cleaner way to use a force against which humans have no defense. So the rack is the apex of biomechanics, a machine for managing anticipation. But its main drawback, irreversible damage, made it legally perilous. Engineering thought faced a challenge: how to inflict maximum pain without applying excessive external force, how to make torture clean and controlled. The answer was brilliant in its simplicity: make the body torture itself. They decided to use the most constant and inescapable force in the universe: gravity. The body weight that supports us can be turned into a weapon if it is concentrated at a single point. Thus, the concept of the Judas cradle was born, a device where the full horror lay not in complex mechanics, but in a simple law of physics and a slow, inexorable downward movement. We have seen the body torn apart. Now we will see it forced to impale itself. How did the force that simply holds us on the ground become a sophisticated instrument of torture? The answer is the Judas cradle. The victim, held by a system of ropes, was slowly lowered onto the point of a wooden pyramid. It seems like a person is simply being sat on something sharp. But the secret is not in the point, but in the physics. Pressure equals force divided by area. The body's weight, the force, remains constant, but the area of support approaches zero. As a result, the pressure on that point becomes colossal. A person weighing 75 kilograms, 165 pounds, concentrated on a point with an area of 1 square centimeter, creates a pressure of 750,000 pascals. This is comparable to the pressure at a depth of 75 meters, 246 feet, underwater. The executioner's main weapon was not a lever, but a rope. He could slightly raise and lower the victim, forcing them to balance on the edge. The torture was not the impalement itself, but the endless process of approaching it. This device was ingenious. but its reality is highly questionable. Why is the Judas cradle, a star of torture museums, almost never mentioned in the judicial records of the Inquisition? The archives and archaeological findings tell a different story. The vast majority of existing cradles are 19th century reconstructions created for spectacle. Of the more than 20 known Judas cradles in museums worldwide, not one can be confidently dated earlier than the 18th century. It is most likely a prime example of the engineering of intimidation. The very concept of being tortured by one's own weight was so horrifying that the mere sight of the device and the threat of its use may have been enough to secure a confession. It was a weapon of psychological warfare. But while some devices were more myth than reality, others, the simplest ones, were terrifyingly real and widespread. And now, a quick question for you. We have examined two devices with different philosophies. On one hand, the Spanish boot, a localized but guaranteed and controlled torture that breaks bones. On the other, the Judas cradle, total, based on gravity, but perhaps more psychological. Put yourself in the place of an inquisitor. You need not to kill, but to obtain a legally clean confession. Which device would you choose as more reliable? Write boot or cradle in the comments right now. Your answer will show if you think like a medieval jurist. It reveals the main principle of the entire system, which we will discuss in the finale. So, we have seen how engineers tried to press gravity into the service of justice, but they encountered problems with control and historical authenticity. These devices were either too messy from a legal standpoint or more psychological in nature. The system needed something universal, cheap, completely controllable, and that struck at the most basic survival instincts. A weapon that doesn't break bones or tear ligaments, but is guaranteed to break the will. They found it not in iron or wood, but in the element that covers 2/3 of our planet. They moved from biomechanics and physics to pure physiology. Next, we will analyze how ordinary water, thanks to a scientific understanding of breathing and panic, became the most common and perhaps the most terrifying instrument of torture. The next exhibit in our hellish museum is in your own home. How could it be that a torture requiring no complex mechanics, only a cloth and water, was considered one of the most effective? The victim is restrained, a cloth is placed over their face, and the executioner slowly pours water from a jug. It seems merely unpleasant, tolerable. But the reality was a brutal shock. The genius was not in drowning, but in hacking basic reflexes. The water, soaking the cloth, blocked the air supply, triggering not just panic, but laryngospasm. The larynx involuntarily slammed shut. The body began to suffocate itself. It's like jamming a cork into the outlet of a running pump. The system performs an emergency shutdown to avoid self-destruction. The engineering essence of the torture was absolute control. As soon as the water was removed, the victim could breathe. This allowed the procedure to be repeated dozens of times without irreversible injury, following a strict protocol. Why did the judicial records of the Inquisition scrupulously specify the exact number of jugs of water? Why such bureaucratic precision? Because it was a legal procedure. The amount of water determined the degree of torture, creating an illusion of legality. But the true purpose is revealed when we remember. The inquisitor was a lawyer, not a sadist. His goal was not pain, but a legally sound confession. And here is the answer to our first paradox. Torture was used in only 2 to 5% of cases. It was an extreme measure, and for its application to be legal, the process had to be strictly formalized. In the records from Toledo in 1578, it is written, 3 measures of water were applied to persuade. Water torture was the perfect solution for a lawyer. It left no marks and fit perfectly within the code. What did the accused actually feel when the first jug of water was poured onto their face? At first, discomfort and cold. The thought that this could be endured waited out. A false sense of control. But the moment the gag reflex and uncontrollable laryngospasm kicked in, the mind shut down. It was a rebellion of one's own body. Time subjectively stretched into an eternity. All that remained were animal instincts, panic, terror, the struggle for a breath. Their own heart pounded in their ears, and the gurgling of the water seemed louder than any scream. The accused was ready to sign any confession just to make the horror stop. The engineering problem was solved. The will was broken by hacking biology. But this was engineering for obtaining confessions. An ancient genius went further. We have just analyzed why simple water was a brilliant engineering solution. Its power lies in the ability to control a person's basic reflexes, turning their own body into a weapon against themselves. This was the pinnacle of rational cruelty in the service of the law. But what if the engineer's goal was not to obtain a confession, but to create maximum suffering as a form of public entertainment? We travel from medieval dungeons to ancient Greece to look at a device that combined thermodynamics and acoustics to create a hellish symphony. This is the story of the Brazen Bull. How did a hollow bronze statue of a bull become not just a furnace, but a complex acoustic device? Its purpose was not to burn a person alive. Its purpose was to transform the screams of agony into the roar of a beast. Inside the bull's head, according to the historian Diodorus Siculus, the Athenian bronzesmith, Paralaus installed a system of tubes. It worked like a natural resonator. A human scream passing through the bronze was modulated and amplified, turning into a furious roar. It was a dual-purpose instrument, a torturous execution for the victim inside and a gruesome musical instrument for the tyrant and spectators outside. What is more terrifying, the execution itself or the idea of turning it into entertainment? But why did this ancient device find no use in the Inquisition's arsenal? The answer lies in its purpose. The bull is linked to the legend of the tyrant Phalaris of Acragas in the 6th century BCE. His goal was not information, but a demonstration of absolute tyranny. However, in 200 years of excavations in Acragas, not a single fragment has been found that can be confidently attributed to the bull. It is most likely an ancient urban legend, a powerful symbol of how engineering genius can serve not the law, but pure sadism. And this myth is merely a prelude to the greatest hoax in the history of torture. A key detail of this legend turns it into a parable. The first person executed in the bull was its own creator, Paralaus. He proudly demonstrated his invention to the tyrant Phalaris, expecting a reward. Instead, Phalaris ordered him to get inside to demonstrate the sound. As soon as the engineer was in the bull, the hatch was locked and a fire was lit beneath its belly. Legend says the tyrant ordered Paralaus to be pulled out while still alive, so his death would not defile the purity of the sound, and then had him thrown from a cliff. The evil he designed for others was turned against its creator. So we have seen two extremes: rational cruelty in the service of the law and symbolic cruelty as an instrument of tyranny. We have learned to distinguish real mechanisms from ancient legends with a moral message. Now we are ready for the main exposé, for the device whose image has become synonymous with the Middle Ages. We are entering the climax of our investigation to uncover the story of the greatest hoax. The story of the Iron Maiden. Imagine an anthropomorphic sarcophagus. Its doors slowly close. Inside are 13 long spikes, positioned with surgical precision to pierce the body but avoid vital organs. The agony can last for hours. This is the pinnacle of sadistic engineering thought, a combination of claustrophobia, pain, and the horror of an inevitable death. And now, the fact: none of this ever happened. Not a single mention in medieval documents, not a single archaeological specimen. The Iron Maiden is a hoax created in the late 18th century. It is younger than the United States of America. But who, and more importantly, why, created this monstrous fake that deceived the entire world? The certainty of a forgery comes from concrete evidence. The first mention of the device dates not to the Middle Ages, but to 1793. The philosopher Johann Siebenkees described a fictional execution of a counterfeiter in his text. It was simply a literary fantasy. The picture changes in the 19th century, during the era of Romanticism and the commercialization of history. Enterprising collectors and museum owners, having read this story, began to create and exhibit real Iron Maidens. This was not a search for historical truth, but the creation of a box office attraction. 19th century engineers designed and sold us our own fear, but why has this commercial product been so resilient? Because this image is the perfect horror meme. It combines several primal fears at once: claustrophobia, fear of penetration, helplessness, and a slow death. It is the perfect recipe for a nightmare. But psychology is only half the answer. During the Enlightenment, it was advantageous to portray the Middle Ages as a time of maximum darkness, ignorance, and savagery to highlight one's own progress against that backdrop. The Iron Maiden became a perfect visual poster for this propaganda. We believe in it not because it existed, but because it is convenient for us to believe in it. It simplifies a complex history into a comfortable black and white picture. So the ultimate symbol of medieval cruelty, an icon of horror, turned out to be a fake, a product of fantasy, commerce, and propaganda. This discovery forces us to completely reconsider our understanding of history. If the most vivid images are lies, what was the truth? We have cleared the field of myths. Now we are ready to assemble all the elements of our investigation: psychological weapons, the biomechanics of pain, legal protocols, and real numbers. We are ready to build a model of the real system, a system based not on sadism, but on cold, rational engineering calculation. And this truth will prove to be more terrifying than any fiction. So we have assembled all the elements: the pillory, the Spanish boot, the rack, water torture. This was not a random collection of tools, but a calibrated system of escalation. A three-stage system. First, a blow to reputation through public humiliation, then localized reversible pain, and only in extreme cases, a total assault on the body. At each stage, the goal was the same: not to kill, not to maim, but to break the will to obtain a legally sound confession. It was an assembly line, but how often was it actually put into operation? We return to the paradox that opened our investigation. Contrary to the myth of a conveyor belt of horror, the Inquisition used physical torture in only 2 to 5% of all cases. This fact shatters everything. Why? Because torture was an expensive, complex, and legally risky procedure for the judges themselves. The threat of torture worked like gravity, unseen, but its constant pressure makes things fall. The very reputation of the engineers of hell and the accused's detailed knowledge of what awaited them were more effective than the actual use of the rack. We thought the horror was in the use of the machines. In reality, it was in their existence. This brings us to our final conclusion. We began with the image of the Iron Maiden, a symbol of chaotic, irrational savagery. We end with the image of the Spanish boot and regulated water torture, symbols of cold, calculated, and systematic cruelty. And the second is more terrifying. Savagery can be blamed on the madness of individuals. But a system where the best engineers work to maximize pain within the bounds of the law and judges consult legal codes is a horror of a different order. There are no traces of rage in the interrogation records. The tone of the entries is that of an accountant meticulously recording the expenditure of coercive measures to achieve the required balance, a confession. After all you have seen, what terrifies you more, the fiction or the reality? In the end, what terrifies you more? The chaos of uncontrolled, insane cruelty as we imagined it before this video, looking at the Iron Maiden, or the system, the cold, rational, and legally justified engineering of pain as it truly was? Write just one word, chaos or system, in the comments, and let's see what we are really afraid of.